Northern Ireland, 1968. A society on the edge of collapse, where the streets themselves seemed to pulse with tension and fear. What began as quiet demands for equality and justice erupted into chaos almost overnight. Peaceful marches were met with batons, firebombs, and bullets. Neighborhoods were barricaded, homes burned, families torn apart. The authorities, sworn to protect, often became instruments of oppression. Ordinary citizens, men, women, and children, found themselves caught in the crossfire of a conflict they had not asked for, a conflict that would spiral into 3 decades of relentless violence. It was a place where a single march could ignite a riot, where the line between protester and combatant was dangerously blurred, and where the first sparks of the Troubles ignited into a blaze that would engulf an entire society. This is part 1 of a 6-part documentary series exploring the turbulent history of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, charting the conflict from 1968 to 1998. The series is structured in 5-year chapters, with each episode dedicated to a specific 5-year period, allowing us to move through the conflict in focused, meaningful segments. In this opening installment, we examine the roots of the unrest, how long-standing social inequalities, political tensions, and demands for civil rights converged to spark the first waves of protest and violence. By taking the story in 5-year intervals, we can trace the gradual escalation of the conflict, understanding not only the major flashpoints but also the quieter, often overlooked developments that shaped the course of events. The story begins not with gunfire or explosions, but with marches. In 1968, ordinary people, men, women, and students, took to the streets of Belfast, Derry, and other towns, demanding what should have been basic human rights: fair housing, equal employment, and an end to decades of systemic discrimination against the Catholic and nationalist communities. The marches were peaceful, disciplined, determined. Their message was simple: equality, justice, dignity. Yet, the response was anything but peaceful. Loyalist groups, fearful that their political and social dominance might be challenged, met these demonstrators with hostility. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, tasked with policing the unrest, often responded with a force that only deepened resentment. In a society already divided along religious and political lines, the streets became a mirror of the underlying tensions, reflecting decades of neglect, mistrust, and simmering anger. By 1969, Northern Ireland was at a tipping point. Riots erupted across Belfast and Derry, engulfing entire neighborhoods in flames, fear, and chaos. Homes were torched, families were uprooted, and communities barricaded themselves in what became no-go zones. In response, the British government deployed troops, initially presented as neutral peacekeepers. But neutrality is fragile in a land divided by identity, religion, and history. For the nationalist communities, the army soon appeared less as protectors and more as occupiers. For Loyalists, their presence was a reassurance, but also a challenge, as the political balance they fought to maintain was threatened by both reformist movements and violent resistance. Amid this turbulence, paramilitary groups began to assert themselves with growing influence. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, formed in 1969, positioned itself as the defender of Catholic neighborhoods and a challenger to British authority. On the other side, Loyalist militias hardened their resolve, prepared to counter any perceived threat to the union with Britain. The conflict was no longer only political or social. It had taken on an armed, violent dimension. Streets were no longer mere pathways between homes and workplaces. They became frontlines, dividing communities, neighbors, and even families. Fear seeped into everyday life. The threat of violence was constant. Shops, schools, and places of worship were all shadowed by tension. 1972 marked the darkest and most pivotal year of these early years. On January 30th, British soldiers opened fire on unarmed civil rights protesters in Derry, killing 14 and wounding many more. Bloody Sunday, as it became known, sent shockwaves throughout Northern Ireland and across the world. Grief, anger, and outrage catalyzed a new wave of recruitment into paramilitary organizations. Nationalist communities that had once hoped for reform through peaceful protest now turned increasingly toward armed resistance. Later that summer, Belfast endured the horrors of Bloody Friday, a day marked by indiscriminate bombings that shattered the city's streets and its sense of security. These events were not isolated. They were part of a pattern, a cycle of action and reaction, grief and retaliation, that would define the Troubles for decades to come. Yet these 5 years were not only defined by violence. Beneath the headlines and the bloodshed, quiet stories unfolded, stories of resilience, courage, and survival. Families navigated a world where fear was constant, yet life went on. Children went to school amid checkpoints and barricades. Neighbors shared resources and offered protection in tightly knit communities. Clergy, activists, and journalists worked tirelessly to document events, bear witness, and advocate for justice. Their accounts remind us that the Troubles were not abstract. They were lived, breathed, and endured by real people whose daily existence was shaped by politics, prejudice, and conflict. As the episodes unfold, we will see how political initiatives rose and fell, how paramilitary groups gained strength, and how communities struggled under relentless pressure. We will explore the attempts at reform, the short-lived experiments in power sharing, and the political missteps that exacerbated division. Using archival footage, expert insight, and personal testimony, this series brings viewers into the lived reality of those who witnessed these decades firsthand. We will hear voices that convey both despair and hope, anger and determination, reflecting a society caught between tradition and transformation. This is more than a timeline. It is a journey through a conflict that reshaped a society. The period from 1968 to 1972 laid the foundations for 3 decades of violence and political struggle. It was a time when civil rights campaigns collided with entrenched power structures, when streets became battlegrounds, and when the human cost of division became painfully clear. The stage was set for the decades of tension, mistrust, and struggle that would follow. And it begins here, with the first 5 crucial years. In these years, we see not only the sparks that ignited the Troubles, but also the enduring human stories of courage, loss, and resilience. This is the beginning of a journey through one of the most complex and tragic conflicts of modern European history, a journey that we will continue, step by step, in the chapters to come. In 1968, Northern Ireland entered a period of deep unrest that marked the beginning of the Troubles. Civil rights protests against discrimination quickly escalated into violent conflict. The year 1968 was pivotal in Northern Ireland's history. For decades, the Catholic minority faced systemic discrimination in housing, employment, and voting rights under a Protestant-dominated government. Inspired by the global civil rights movement, activists formed the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, NICRA, to demand equality. Peaceful marches began in the summer, but tensions rose as police and Loyalist groups responded harshly. The most significant event occurred in October 1968, when a civil rights march in Derry was banned. Protesters defied the ban, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, attacked demonstrators with batons, an incident broadcast on television that shocked the public. This violence exposed the deep divisions between Catholic nationalists, who sought reform or reunification with Ireland, and Protestant Unionists, who feared losing their dominance and ties to Britain. The clashes of 1968 set the stage for escalating unrest, leading to widespread rioting in 1969 and the eventual deployment of British troops. What began as a campaign for civil rights transformed into a decades-long conflict involving paramilitary groups, state forces, and communities torn apart by sectarian strife. On October 5, 1968, a group of people marched for something you'd think would be simple: fairness. They carried signs demanding basic rights that most people in the UK had taken for granted. But by the end of the day, their own police force had beaten them bloody in the street. Their crime? Defying a government ban on their protest. And the television cameras broadcast it all to a horrified world. That single moment, the sight of uniformed officers clubbing unarmed citizens, would become the spark that lit the fuse of the Troubles, a brutal conflict that would burn for 3 decades. This is the story of how 1 year and 1 march turned a peaceful call for justice into a war. To understand how things exploded in 1968, you have to get your head around the strange state of Northern Ireland. It was created in 1921 when Ireland was partitioned, with borders drawn to ensure a strong, long-term Protestant and Unionist majority loyal to the British Crown. But that meant a large Catholic and nationalist minority was left inside, feeling more connected to the Republic of Ireland and, more importantly, feeling like second-class citizens in their own home. For nearly 50 years, the government at Stormont was run by a single party, the Ulster Unionist Party, which oversaw a system of quiet, but deeply effective discrimination. And this wasn't an accident, it was political engineering. In places like the city of Derry, which had a clear Catholic majority, electoral boundaries were drawn so bizarrely that Unionists always held power. This practice, known as gerrymandering, kept political power locked in Protestant hands. But the inequality went way deeper than the ballot box. It was woven into the fabric of everyday life. For the Catholic minority, discrimination was a daily grind. The system wasn't just about political control, it was about enforcing a social hierarchy. One of the sharpest tools for this was public housing. Unionist-controlled local councils decided who got a house and who didn't, and they consistently favored Protestant families over Catholic ones, even when Catholic families were in more desperate need. This was a method of social containment, and its effects could help ensure Catholic populations didn't grow in areas that might tip an electoral balance. In one infamous case in June 1968, a council house in Escalating, County Tyrone, was given to a 19-year-old unmarried Protestant woman, the secretary of a local Unionist politician, while two large, homeless Catholic families were left waiting. It was this kind of blatant injustice that was making people furious. Then there was the issue of voting. While the rest of the UK had universal suffrage, Northern Ireland clung to old rules. In local elections, your right to vote was tied to property. Only people who owned or rented a house and their spouses could vote. This system automatically disenfranchised poorer people, many of whom were Catholics living in overcrowded homes with their parents. On top of that, business owners got extra votes, in some cases as many as 6 or 7. Since Protestants were more likely to own businesses and property, the system was heavily stacked in their favor. The demand for one man, one vote became a central rallying cry. It wasn't a call for revolution, but for the same basic democratic rights people had just across the Irish Sea. And if you had a problem with any of this, who could you turn to? The police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, was over 90% Protestant. Many Catholics didn't see it as an impartial police force, but as the armed enforcer of a biased state. This feeling was made worse by the Ulster Special Constabulary, known as the B Specials. This was a part-time, almost exclusively Protestant police reserve. Within the Catholic community, they were notorious, with a reputation for sectarian violence going all the way back to the 1920s. To many nationalists, the B Specials were seen as little more than a state-sanctioned Loyalist militia, and their presence was a source of constant fear. All these grievances in housing, voting, and policing had created a pressure cooker. By the mid-1960s, a new generation was coming of age, and they just weren't willing to put up with it anymore. The 1960s was a decade of global protest. From the civil rights movement in America to student uprisings in Paris, a spirit of activism was in the air, and it didn't stop at the Irish Sea. Thanks to post-war education reforms, a new generation of Catholics was emerging. They were confident, articulate, and watching Martin Luther King Jr. lead peaceful marches on their TVs. They saw a clear parallel between the struggle of African Americans and their own situation, and they decided to borrow the playbook, nonviolent civil disobedience. In January 1967, this energy came together in a new organization, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, or NICRA. It was a surprisingly broad church, founded by trade unionists, socialists, liberals, and even some moderate Republicans and unionists. Their goals weren't about ending partition or overthrowing the state. They were focused on one thing: winning basic democratic reforms inside Northern Ireland. NICRA's demands were clear. They wanted an end to gerrymandering and one man, one vote in local elections. They wanted fair housing allocation. They wanted the repeal of the draconian Special Powers Act, which let the government arrest and imprison people without trial. And they wanted the hated B Specials to be disbanded. It was a platform for equality, not rebellion. The organization committed itself to nonviolence, believing that by peacefully exposing the state's injustices, they could force both the Belfast government and the British government in London to finally step in. People like John Hume and MP Gerry Fitt pushed these issues into the mainstream, while grassroots activists organized on the ground, all of them united by the belief that peaceful protest could work where quiet resentment had failed. The first big test of this strategy came on August 24, 1968. Sparked by the housing protest in Caledon, activists organized a march from the small town of Coal Island to Dungannon. The goal was to protest housing discrimination by the local unionist council. About 2,500 people showed up, way more than expected, proving just how much discontent was simmering under the surface. The march itself was peaceful, but they were met by a heavy police presence and a counter-demonstration by hardline Loyalists, including their fiery leader, Reverend Ian Paisley. The RUC blocked the protesters from entering the town center, citing the risk of disorder. The day ended without major violence, but it set a grim pattern that would repeat itself, with worse consequences each time. A peaceful demand for rights, met with official obstruction and the threatening presence of Loyalists, who saw the whole civil rights movement as a front for Irish republicanism. Still, the activists felt a sense of momentum. They had brought thousands onto the streets and drawn attention to their cause. Support for NICRA grew fast. Emboldened, they planned their next march. This time, they would go to the city that was the very symbol of gerrymandering and discrimination, Derry. It was a decision that would change everything. Derry, or Londonderry, as it's officially known and called by Unionists, was the perfect symbol of the fight. It was a city with a large Catholic and nationalist majority, but for decades it had been ruled by a Unionist-controlled council. This was possible only because of extreme gerrymandering, where the voting districts were drawn to guarantee a Unionist win no matter how people voted. The city also suffered from terrible unemployment and a severe housing shortage that hit the Catholic community hardest. It was, as one activist put it, the capital city of injustice. So NICRA and local activists planned a march for Saturday, October 5, 1968. The route was set to cross the Craigavon Bridge and end in the city's central square, the Diamond. The government's hardline Minister of Home Affairs, William Craig, responded by banning the march completely. The official reason was the risk of disorder, but to the marchers, it felt like the state was once again shutting down peaceful protest. On October 5th, about 400 protesters gathered anyway, defying the ban. Among them were students, locals, and even several politicians, including MP Gerry Fitt and 3 British MPs who were there to observe. Crucially, a TV crew from Ireland's national broadcaster, RTE, was also there. As the marchers approached the police line on Duke Street, their path was blocked by a wall of RUC officers. The crowd behind them grew to about 2,000. Then, an order was given to disperse the crowd. What happened next was chaos, all captured by the cameras. Police drew their batons and charged, striking protesters indiscriminately. Men and women were beaten to the ground. Gerry Fitt, a member of parliament, was filmed with blood pouring down his face after being hit on the head. A water cannon was turned on the crowd, soaking everyone, including the camera crew trying to film the brutality. The images were shocking, raw, and undeniable. They were broadcast that night across Ireland and then around the world. Suddenly, the problems of Northern Ireland weren't just some internal affair. They were an international scandal. The sight of a British police force brutally attacking British citizens who were asking for basic British rights caused outrage, especially in London. The government's violent response had backfired, spectacularly. By trying to crush the movement, it had proven every claim the marchers had made about an oppressive state. It had lit the fuse. The violence of October 5th was a watershed moment. That television footage transformed everything overnight. For many Catholics and nationalists, any hope that the Northern Ireland government would listen to reason was gone. Seeing the RUC act with such brutality confirmed their worst fears. The state wasn't there to protect them, but to put them down. The event became a massive recruiting tool for more radical groups. In the wake of the march and the protests that followed, students at Queen's University Belfast formed a new, more impatient group called People's Democracy, frustrated by what they saw as NICRA's caution. Across Northern Ireland, nationalist communities were electrified. The marches had started as a plea, but now they were a defiant roar. In Derry, 2 days of serious rioting followed the police attack. The shared experience of state violence created a powerful sense of solidarity and a refusal to back down. At the same time, the event drove the two sides further apart than ever before. To many hardline Unionists, this was proof of what they'd feared all along. They saw the riots not as a reaction to police brutality, but as evidence that the civil rights movement was just a cover for a Republican plot to destroy Northern Ireland. Figures like Ian Paisley won more support by painting the marchers as thugs and rebels. Back in London, the British government could no longer look away. The Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, put immense pressure on his Northern Irish counterpart, Terence O'Neill. O'Neill was a moderate unionist who had been trying to slowly reform Northern Ireland, but now he was cornered. The events in Derry had exposed the deep sickness in his state for the whole world to see. In November 1968, trying to calm the storm, Prime Minister O'Neill announced a 5-point reform package. It promised changes to housing allocation and the creation of an ombudsman to handle complaints. In return, NICRA agreed to pause its marches to give the reforms a chance. But O'Neill was caught. For many activists, the reforms were too little too late. Critically, they didn't include one man, one vote. But for hardline unionists, O'Neill's concessions were a total betrayal, a surrender to the mob. He made a famous TV speech, telling the people they stood at the crossroads. His plea for calm fell on deaf ears. In January 1969, the student-led People's Democracy Group, tired of the pause, decided to force the issue. They organized a long march from Belfast to Derry, deliberately modeled on Martin Luther King's Selma to Montgomery March. Their goal was to expose the raw sectarian hatred that the government couldn't or wouldn't control. And it worked all too well. For 4 days, the small group of marchers was repeatedly harassed by Loyalist counter-protesters. The police who were supposed to be protecting them often just stood by. The whole thing reached a horrific climax on January 4th at Burntollet Bridge, just outside Derry. There, the marchers were ambushed by a Loyalist mob of around 200, including off-duty B specials, armed with stones, iron bars, and nail-studded clubs. The students were savagely beaten, while RUC officers largely looked on. The Burntollet ambush was another devastating blow. It proved that the violence wasn't just coming from the state, but from sectarian mobs that the state seemed unwilling to stop. For nationalists, what little faith they had left in the RUC was destroyed. Meanwhile, Loyalist paramilitary groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, started a bombing campaign, hoping the chaos would bring down O'Neill's government. Northern Ireland was sliding, step by step, into open conflict. The final drop came in the summer of 1969. In Derry, the city was a tinderbox. The spark was the annual Apprentice Boys Parade on August 12th, a massive Loyalist celebration. Its traditional route passed right by the edge of the Bogside, the city's main Catholic area. In the atmosphere of 1969, this wasn't seen as a tradition, it was seen as a provocation. As the parade went by, clashes broke out. The city exploded. For 3 days, the Bogside became a battlefield. Residents threw up barricades and fought the RUC with a rain of stones and petrol bombs. The police responded with huge amounts of CS gas, the first time it had ever been used by police in the UK. Exhausted and overwhelmed, the RUC were driven out. The area was declared Free Derry. The Battle of the Bogside, as it became known, set off a chain reaction. To pull police away from Derry, nationalists in other cities started to riot. In Belfast, the unrest descended into vicious sectarian street fighting as Loyalist mobs, sometimes helped by police, attacked Catholic neighborhoods. Entire streets were set on fire. On August 14th, 6 people were killed, including a 9-year-old boy, the first child to die in the Troubles. The Northern Ireland government had lost control. The RUC was collapsing. In a desperate move, they asked London for soldiers. On the afternoon of August 14th, 1969, British troops rolled onto the streets of Derry, and then Belfast. Their job was to restore order, to be a neutral force. And at first, many Catholics welcomed them as protectors from the RUC and the mobs. But that welcome wouldn't last. The army's arrival didn't end the violence. It was the beginning of a new and much deadlier chapter. Northern Ireland had passed the point of no return. The story of how that initial welcome for British troops curdled into bitter hostility, and how the conflict spiraled into a guerrilla war with the Provisional IRA and Loyalist paramilitaries, is a story for our next video, part 2 in our series The Troubles on Emerald Chronicle. If you want to see that video and the rest of this major series, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's turning points. The arc from 1968 to 1969 is the story of a dream dying. A movement born from the hopeful spirit of the 1960s, seeking only basic rights through peaceful means, was met with violence and refusal. The divisions in Northern Ireland were centuries old, but it was the events of this period that turned deep political problems into a full-blown armed conflict. The batons that fell on Duke Street, captured on camera for the world to see, shattered any illusion of peaceful reform. They showed that the state would not bend, it would only try to break those who challenged it. The marchers in 1968 asked for fairness. What they got was a lesson in power, and in the process, they inadvertently dragged Northern Ireland into a war that would define it for a generation, proving that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is peacefully ask for change. "1968 ended not in peace, but in anticipation. On the surface, nothing had yet collapsed. The government of Northern Ireland still stood. The streets, though tense, were not yet war zones. The police still patrolled. The laws still functioned. Shops still opened their doors each morning. To an outsider, the system looked intact. But beneath that thin layer of normality, something irreversible had begun. The old certainties were cracking, and a new reality was pressing in from beneath. For the first time since the foundation of Northern Ireland, the state had been publicly challenged by its own citizens. Ordinary men and women, students, workers, parents, had marched to demand fair treatment, equal voting rights, and basic human dignity. These were not revolutionary demands. They were democratic, lawful, and moral. And yet, the response they met was not compromise, but batons, water cannons, and violence. The images from Derry and elsewhere, broadcast across the world in October 1968, stripped away the carefully maintained illusion of stability. What viewers saw was not a disorderly mob, but unarmed demonstrators being beaten by their own police for daring to ask for equality. Decades of discrimination, once hidden in local councils and housing lists, were suddenly exposed to international scrutiny. Northern Ireland could no longer conceal its divisions in silence. But perhaps the most dangerous outcome of 1968 was not the violence itself, it was the loss of faith. Nationalists lost faith in the impartiality of the police. Unionists lost faith in their government's ability to maintain control. Moderates on both sides began to disappear, drowned out by rising anger and fear. The middle ground, always fragile, began to collapse under the weight of history. The civil rights movement had succeeded in forcing the world to look, but it had also triggered something darker. For many Unionists, equality felt like surrender. For many nationalists, patience now felt like betrayal. A line had been crossed, not legally but psychologically. Once crossed, it could not be walked back. By December 1968, the question was no longer if Northern Ireland would change, but how violently it would resist that change. The language of rights was slowly being replaced by the language of defense. Marches were beginning to look more like confrontations. Neighborhoods were starting to organize along religious lines. Rumors spread faster than reason. Old memories from the 1920s and earlier began to resurface, passed down like warnings through families and communities. The year that had begun with peaceful footsteps on cold pavement was ending with clenched fists on both sides of the divide. 1968 had lit the match. In this 30-part series, we will continue to examine the conflict one year at a time, decoding the decisions, mistakes, and events that transformed a small corner of the world into one of the most violent conflict zones in modern Europe. And in part 2, we step into the fire. 1969 is the year everything breaks, when houses burn, barricades rise, and British troops are sent onto the streets of Belfast and Derry. The year when civil rights collapse into sectarian war. The year the troubles truly begin. "1969 marked the true outbreak of the troubles in Northern Ireland, as civil rights protests spiraled into widespread sectarian violence. The year began with growing tension between Catholic nationalists and Protestant Unionists. In January, the Burntollet Bridge ambush saw civil rights marchers attacked by Loyalists, deepening mistrust of the authorities. Throughout the year, demonstrations demanding equal housing, jobs, and voting rights were met with hostility, and sporadic clashes intensified. The situation exploded in August 1969 during the Battle of the Bogside in Derry, when residents resisted police attempts to suppress protests. For 3 days, the city was engulfed in rioting, with barricades erected and petrol bombs thrown. Violence spread to Belfast and other towns, where sectarian mobs burned homes, forcing over 1,800 families to flee. By mid-August, more than 150 houses were destroyed, 8 people killed, and hundreds injured. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, viewed by many Catholics as biased, struggled to contain the unrest. In response, the British government deployed troops, initially welcomed by Catholics as neutral peacekeepers. Yet their presence soon became a symbol of occupation. The events of 1969 transformed a civil rights campaign into a protracted conflict, laying the foundations for 3 decades of paramilitary violence, political deadlock, and deep communal division. August 1969. The streets of Belfast are a landscape of fire. Entire blocks consumed by flames, forcing thousands of families to flee their homes with only what they could carry. In the city of Derry, barricades seal off whole communities, transforming them into fortresses against the police. On street corners, children are piling stones, preparing petrol bombs. Soon, the British Army will arrive in full combat gear to begin the longest continuous operation in its history. How did it come to this? How did this corner of the United Kingdom descend into a brutal conflict that would rage for some 30 years? How did a movement for equality, for basic human rights, explode into war? The story begins in the cold, tense dawn of 1969. To understand 1969, one must first understand the Northern Ireland that existed before it. For almost 50 years, since the partition of Ireland in the early 1920s, the state was a political ecosystem built on a foundation of division. It was a place of 2 communities living side by side but worlds apart. The Protestant, Unionist majority controlled the government, the police, and the economy. The Catholic nationalist minority, more than a third of the population, was viewed with deep suspicion, its loyalty constantly in question. They were in practice second-class citizens. This wasn't just a feeling, it was a system. In places like Derry, gerrymandering was so blatant that the city's nationalist majority was ruled by a unionist minority. If you were Catholic, getting a council house was an uphill battle. Finding a job, especially a government one, was often impossible. The system was designed to maintain what its first prime minister had called a Protestant state for a Protestant people. The police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary or RUC, was overwhelmingly Protestant and widely seen not as an impartial force of law and order, but as a defender of the unionist establishment. And then there were the B Specials, an exclusively Protestant, part-time police reserve. They were viewed by many Catholics as a sectarian militia in uniform, a constant, menacing symbol of the state's power and its bias. But by the late 1960s, the world was changing. From Paris to Prague, people were demanding a new order. In the United States, the civil rights movement, led by figures like Martin Luther King Jr., was proving that peaceful protest could challenge an unjust system. Inspired by these images, a new generation in Northern Ireland began to believe that their time had also come. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association was formed. Its demands were simple and non-sectarian: one man, one vote, an end to discrimination, fair housing, freedom of speech. While many involved held nationalist aspirations, the official platform was not for a united Ireland. It was a demand for equality as citizens of the United Kingdom. Their marches were met with suspicion from the government and violent hostility from Loyalist counter-demonstrators. Still, the movement grew. But it was a student-led group, the more radical People's Democracy, that decided to force the issue. Inspired by Martin Luther King's Selma to Montgomery March, they announced a 4-day trek from Belfast to Derry to begin on New Year's Day, 1969. And just like in Selma, it was destined to be met with violence. From the moment the small group of students left Belfast on January 1st, 1969, they were harassed. The march was denounced by hardline Loyalists, who saw it as a Republican plot. As they walked through the wintry countryside, their numbers grew, but so did the hostility. At nearly every stop, they were confronted by angry counter-demonstrators. The RUC did little to stop the intimidation, often rerouting the marchers instead of clearing their path. The students felt isolated, exposed. The final day was January 4th. The marchers, now a few hundred strong, set off from the village of Claudy for the last 7 miles of their journey to Derry. Ahead lay Burntollet Bridge, a small concrete crossing over a shallow river. It was here that the trap was sprung. As the marchers approached, they saw a crowd of around 200 Loyalists waiting on the high ground, armed with clubs, iron bars, bottles, and stones. It was later widely reported that among the attackers were many off-duty members of the B Specials, with some estimates putting the number at over 100. The attack was pre-planned and savage. Stones, brought in from a nearby quarry, rained down on the protesters. The RUC officers who had assured the marchers of their safety largely stood by. Some protesters were beaten to the ground, others were forced into the freezing river. Michael Farrell, one of the organizers, recalled a police officer telling him, "You'd better get out of here immediately or they'll kill you." At least a dozen marchers had to be hospitalized. When the battered marchers finally limped into Derry, they were attacked again. That night, instead of pursuing the attackers, RUC officers were widely reported to have gone on a rampage through the Catholic Bogside area, breaking into homes and attacking residents. The ambush at Burntollet Bridge was a watershed. For many in the Catholic community, it was the final, irrefutable proof that the state and its police force were not neutral arbiters. Trust was shattered. The hope that peaceful protest could bring reform began to die. If the state would not protect its citizens, they would have to protect themselves. The path of civil rights was now leading directly to confrontation. A later official inquiry, the Cameron Report, stated the police's failure to provide protection had provoked serious hostility and an increasing disbelief in their impartiality. The aftermath of Burntollet saw Northern Ireland slide deeper into instability. The Prime Minister, Terence O'Neill, was trapped. His modest reforms were too much for hardline unionists and far too little for an increasingly angry nationalist community. In March and April, Loyalist paramilitaries from the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, bombed water and electricity installations, initially blaming the largely inactive IRA to increase tensions and force O'Neill's resignation. The deception worked. He resigned at the end of April. Meanwhile, on the streets, clashes grew more frequent and more violent. In April, during riots in Derry, RUC officers broke into the home of a 42-year-old taxi driver named Samuel Devaney. They beat him and his family with batons. Devaney died from his injuries 3 months later and is now often regarded as one of the first victims of the Troubles. His funeral was a silent sea of fury. As the summer of 1969 approached, the air was thick with dread. The marching season, with its traditional Loyalist parades, was always tense. The climax is the annual Apprentice Boys of Derry parade on August 12th. Its route traditionally passed alongside the Catholic Bogside, a path seen by residents as a deliberate provocation. That year, it was the spark in a tinderbox. As the parade passed the edge of the Bogside, taunts were exchanged, then stones were thrown. The scuffle rapidly escalated as the RUC charged into the Bogside. They were met with a hail of stones and petrol bombs from thousands of residents determined to keep them out. This was the beginning of the Battle of the Bogside. It was not a chaotic riot, but an organized community defense. Barricades sealed the area off. For 3 days and 2 nights, the residents fought the police to a standstill. Exhausted and demoralized, the RUC deployed CS gas for the first time in UK history, blanketing the densely populated area in a choking cloud. The force was all but broken. As news of the siege in Derry spread, solidarity protests erupted across Northern Ireland. The call went out to stretch the RUC to its breaking point. The result was an explosion of violence. The bloodiest clashes were in Belfast. On the night of August 14th, the city descended into a sectarian frenzy. Loyalist mobs, in some cases reportedly assisted by police, launched attacks on Catholic districts with petrol bombs and guns. Entire streets were set ablaze. Most of the houses on Bombay Street, a Catholic enclave, were burned out. Estimates suggest that over 1,800 families, the vast majority of them Catholic, were displaced in the August riots alone. At least 8 people were killed in the Belfast rioting. In the chaos, police in an armored car fired a heavy machine gun at the Divis Flats complex, killing 9-year-old Patrick Rooney as he lay in his bed. For many Catholics, it was terrifying confirmation that the old IRA had failed to protect them. Graffiti appeared on Belfast walls. "IRA, I ran away." This sense of abandonment created fertile ground for a new, more aggressive republicanism. With the RUC overwhelmed and Northern Ireland on the edge of civil war, the government in Belfast made a fateful call to London for help. In Dublin, the Irish Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, announced that the Irish government could no longer stand by. To many Unionists, this was perceived as a threat of invasion. On the afternoon of August 14, 1969, the British government gave the order. Operation Banner was initiated. British troops deployed first in Derry. Their arrival ended the Battle of the Bogside. The exhausted RUC withdrew, and the soldiers took their positions, crucially, without attempting to enter the barricaded area, which for a time became a no-go zone known as Free Derry. Initially, many Catholics welcomed the army as neutral protectors. But the honeymoon would be tragically short. The soldiers were there to assert the authority of the British state and support the police. Their presence and their tactics in the months and years to come would alienate the very community they were first sent to protect. The events of August 1969 are widely seen as the point of no return. A campaign for civil rights, born from a desire for equality, had been consumed by sectarian hatred. By the end of the year, conflict-related violence had claimed at least 18 lives. The peace walls built in Belfast to separate communities became permanent scars on the landscape. The long-term consequences were even more profound. In December 1969, Republicans, disillusioned by the failure to defend Catholic areas, split from the existing IRA to form the Provisional Irish Republican Army. The Provos were committed to an armed struggle to end British rule by force. On the other side, Loyalist paramilitary groups like the UVF and the newly formed Ulster Defence Association were galvanized. 1969 was the year the Troubles, as they came to be known, truly began. The political crisis led to the eventual abolition of the Northern Ireland government. The British Army's deployment began a 38-year military operation that would see around 300,000 soldiers serve and over 700 die. The explosion of violence set the stage for a conflict of bombings, assassinations, and sectarian killings that would claim over 3,500 lives. It all began here, in the fire and fury of 1969, when a generation's hope for peaceful change was buried under the rubble. "1969 ended not with resolution, but with a terrible kind of clarity. The illusion of reform within the existing system had shattered. The belief that equal rights could be won through peaceful protest was now buried beneath burned streets, broken bodies, and the echo of gunfire. What had begun as a movement inspired by hope and justice had been swallowed by fear, retaliation, and sectarian fury. Ancient grievances, once simmering beneath the surface of daily life, now erupted openly, unleashed in full view of the world. Northern Ireland was no longer merely divided, it was in open conflict with itself. The arrival of the British Army, initially welcomed by many in the nationalist community as a protective force, marked the beginning of a new and ominous chapter. Soldiers now patrolled streets where children once played. Barbed wire replaced garden hedges. Watchtowers rose where streetlights once stood. Communities withdrew into themselves, ringed by barricades and suspicion. What was meant to be a short-term measure became a permanent transformation of society. Normal life dissolved into a reality defined by checkpoints, surveillance, raids, and reprisal. By the close of the year, the lines were drawn. The formation of the Provisional IRA signaled a new commitment to armed struggle, fueled by despair, anger, and a determination never again to be defenseless. On the other side, Loyalist paramilitary groups fortified their own positions, convinced they were under siege and fighting for their very existence. The space for dialogue, already fragile, virtually disappeared. In its place grew a cold, entrenched certainty on both sides, that only force would now decide the future. The streets of Belfast and Derry became symbols of a deeper tragedy, not just a political conflict, but a human one. Families driven from homes that had sheltered generations. Children growing up behind walls built not for safety, but for separation. A society hardened by bitterness, where grief became inherited and distrust became law. The physical scars, burned-out houses, bomb-damaged streets, barricades, and peace lines, were only shadows of the deeper wounds inflicted on the collective psyche of the people. 1969 did not merely witness the beginning of violence, it institutionalized it. It normalized it. It prepared an entire generation for a life lived in the company of soldiers, sirens, and funerals. It transformed neighbors into enemies and neighborhoods into territories. Every brick thrown at Burntollet, Every petrol bomb hurled in the bogside, every home destroyed in Belfast pushed Northern Ireland one step further from reconciliation and one step deeper into war. This was the moment the past and the present collided. The unresolved wounds of partition, identity, and power all burst to the surface at once. And when the flames finally died down at the end of that summer, they left behind something even more dangerous than fire: a permanent war of memory, vengeance, and survival. In this 30-part series, we will continue to trace that descent, one year at a time, to understand how a modern European society unraveled into 3 decades of violence. Each episode will focus on a single year, examining the key events, decisions, and turning points that shaped the conflict. In Part 3, we move into the year 1970, a year when lines hardened, loyalties shifted, and the first full patterns of the coming war emerged. The streets were no longer just burning in moments of crisis. By 1970, the fire had settled into a postillon, inescapable presence, and there was no turning back. "1970 was a turning point in the Troubles, as paramilitary groups consolidated and violence escalated beyond sporadic riots into organized conflict. In January 1970, the Ulster Defence Regiment, UDR, was established as a locally recruited force to replace the disbanded B Specials, though many Catholics distrusted it as another unionist-dominated institution. At the same time, the Irish Republican Army, IRA, split into 2 factions: the official IRA, which leaned toward Marxist politics, and the Provisional IRA, which prioritized armed struggle to defend Catholic communities and push for Irish reunification. This division marked the beginning of sustained paramilitary campaigns. Throughout the year, sectarian clashes intensified. In Belfast, Loyalist groups such as the newly formed Ulster Defence Association, UDA, began organizing to counter Republican violence. Bombings, shootings, and street battles became more frequent, with civilians increasingly caught in the crossfire. The British Army, deployed since 1969, found itself drawn deeper into the conflict, shifting from peacekeeping to counterinsurgency operations. By the end of 1970, Northern Ireland had moved from civil rights protests into entrenched paramilitary warfare. The events of this year hardened divisions, entrenched mistrust of state institutions, and set the stage for the bloodier years that followed. In 1969, many in Northern Ireland hoped for peace. The arrival of British troops was seen by some as a temporary shield between warring communities. But by the end of 1970, that hope was gone. The streets were becoming battlegrounds, new paramilitary armies had formed, and the dream of civil rights had been swallowed by the nightmare of a rapidly escalating conflict. While the Troubles had roots reaching back years, even centuries, 1970 was the year the conflict transformed. This is the story of that pivotal year. The final months of the 1960s left Northern Ireland on a knife's edge. The civil rights movement, inspired by peaceful protests in the United States, had shone a light on deep-seated discrimination against the Catholic minority. But their marches were often met with violence. The summer of 1969 exploded into chaos with the Battle of the Bogside in Derry and sectarian rioting in Belfast that left entire streets in ashes. The police force, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, RUC, was overwhelmed. In August 1969, the British Army was deployed in Operation Banner. Initially, many Catholics welcomed the soldiers, seeing them as neutral protectors. A fragile, exhausted calm settled. But this was a peace built on sand. Beneath the surface, the forces that would tear Northern Ireland apart for 3 decades were gathering strength. The old Irish Republican Army, IRA, had been mocked for failing to defend Catholic areas during the 1969 riots, with graffiti declaring I ran away. On the other side, Loyalists, fearing that any concession to nationalists was a step towards a united Ireland, were beginning to organize. 1970 would not be a year of reconciliation. It was the year street riots evolved into an organized armed conflict, a year of fractures, formations, and fire. To understand the explosion of 1970, you have to look at how policing was structured. For decades, the main backup for the RUC was the Ulster Special Constabulary, the B Specials. This was a part-time, armed reserve that was almost entirely Protestant and deeply distrusted by Catholics. Following the 1969 riots, the government-commissioned Hunt report made a stark recommendation. The B Specials had to go. For Unionists, it felt like their ultimate defense was being dismantled. For nationalists, it was the removal of a hated symbol. But what would replace it? The answer was created by the Ulster Defence Regiment Act of 1969, which brought a new force into existence on January 1, 1970, the Ulster Defence Regiment, or UDR. It became operational on April 1st. The British government's aim was a locally recruited, part-time force under British Army command, open to both Protestants and Catholics. The UDR's official role was the defense of life or property, against armed attack or sabotage, pointedly not crowd or riot control. From the start, the vision of a balanced force crumbled. Initial Catholic recruitment was around 16%, but that number would soon plummet. The IRA saw the UDR as a British colonial regiment and began intimidating Catholic recruits. Some sources cite Private Sean Russell as the first Catholic UDR soldier to be killed by the IRA in late 1970, sending a chilling message to other Catholics in the regiment. Furthermore, many nationalists saw the UDR as the B Specials in a new uniform, especially as many former Specials rushed to join. The force, which had an initial recruitment target of around 6,000 men, was under strength when it launched, with only about 2,400 enrolled by April. It quickly became an overwhelmingly Protestant regiment. Instead of bridging the sectarian divide, the UDR's formation accidentally reinforced it. This was made worse by accusations of collusion with Loyalist paramilitaries. A declassified British military intelligence report from 1973, titled Subversion in the UDR, acknowledged that a significant number of UDR soldiers were also members of Loyalist paramilitary groups, and that the regiment had become a major source of modern weapons for them. The first major security development of 1970 had failed its political objective. It hadn't created a force for unity. For many, it created another symbol of a divided society. As the state restructured its forces, the Republican movement was tearing itself apart. The IRA of 1969 was a shadow of its former self, with a leadership that had embraced Marxist politics, believing a united Ireland would come from uniting the working classes, not through violence. This political strategy was a major problem for younger, more militant Republicans who had just witnessed the 1969 riots. They believed in the traditional Republican goal, that British rule in Ireland was illegitimate and could only be ended by force. They saw the failure to defend Catholic areas like Bombay Street in Belfast as a profound betrayal. In December 1969, this ideological chasm ripped the movement in two. At an IRA convention, a faction led by figures like Sean MacSteofan walked out, refusing to accept the leadership's new political direction. They established their own Provisional Army Council. Those who remained became known as the official IRA. This split, finalized in early 1970, was arguably the single most important development in the radicalization of the conflict. The official IRA would lean more toward political agitation, while the Provisional IRA had a singular, brutal purpose. Their strategy was clear: defend nationalist areas, then retaliate, and finally, launch a full-scale guerrilla war to make Northern Ireland ungovernable. The Provos, as they became known, immediately set about proving their worth. During severe rioting in June 1970, they engaged in a 5-hour gun battle with Loyalists attacking the Catholic Short Strand enclave, presenting themselves as the district's saviors. The Provos gained immense credibility by doing what the old IRA had failed to do. They fought back. For many young, angry Catholics who felt defenseless, the Provisional IRA became their army. This defensive posture quickly became an offensive one. According to some estimates, there were over 130 bombings in 1970. The number of killings, which stood around 16 in 1969, rose to about 26 in 1970, according to data from the Kane Project. The Provisional IRA was building its capacity, preparing for what they called the Long War, and 1970 was their foundational year. While Loyalist paramilitary groups existed before, 1970 saw them organize and escalate their own violence. The most prominent was the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, which had been formed in 1966 but became increasingly active. In January 1970, the UVF began bombing Catholic-owned businesses, vowing to remove Republican elements from Loyalist areas. That year saw a wave of bombings against Catholic-owned pubs and businesses. Their campaign also crossed the border, with separate attacks targeting a radio mast in County Donegal and infrastructure in Dublin. The UVF wasn't alone. Vigilante defence associations in Loyalist parts of Belfast began to merge, formally creating the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, in 1971. These groups, which had been active in 1970, organized patrols and manned barricades. Though the UDA wouldn't be outlawed for many years, its members were involved in sectarian violence from the start. By the end of 1970, the conflict had become a terrifying three-way war. The Provisional IRA fought to destroy the state. Loyalist paramilitaries waged their own war to defend it, often through attacks on the Catholic community. And caught in the middle was the British Army, increasingly seen as an enemy by both sides. The initial welcome for the British Army in Catholic areas was about to be shattered by one of the most significant events of 1970, the Falls Curfew. On July 3rd, after a weapons search in the staunchly Republican Lower Falls area of Belfast, a skirmish with local youths escalated into a gun battle between the army and the official IRA. The local British commander, General Ian Freeland, made a fateful decision. He ordered the entire area, some 3,000 homes, to be sealed off and placed under military curfew. Around 3,000 troops poured into the zone. What followed was approximately 34 hours of collective punishment. House-to-house searches were carried out with brutal abandon. Doors were kicked in, floorboards ripped up, and furniture broken. All the while, huge amounts of CS gas were fired into the area, affecting everyone from infants to the elderly. For the people trapped inside, it was a nightmare, and 4 civilians were killed by the army during the operation. One man, Charles O'Neill, was run down by an armored vehicle. Figures vary, but sources state that over 330 people were arrested and at least 78 were wounded. The army did find a haul of weapons, mostly belonging to the official IRA, but the political cost was catastrophic. The curfew was finally broken on July 5th, not by military force, but by an extraordinary act of civil resistance. Thousands of women and children from the nearby nationalist area of Andersonstown marched toward the curfew zone with food and supplies. Overwhelmed by the human wave, the soldiers stood aside, and the curfew ended. The Falls Curfew was arguably the moment the British Army lost the consent of the Catholic community for good. Before, they could be seen as neutral peacekeepers. After, many saw them as a hostile army of occupation. The event served as a massive recruitment sergeant for the Provisional IRA, validating their argument that the British state would only respond with force. The honeymoon period was definitively over. The war was on. The descent into the Troubles was filled with complex and tragic turning points like the events of 1970. If you find this analysis insightful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into these crucial historical moments. The story of this conflict is far from over. Our 30-part series The Troubles 1968 to 1998 is only available on Emerald Chronicle. The year 1970 began with a flicker of hope, but ended with the darkness of a rapidly intensifying armed conflict. It was the year that transformed the Troubles from a crisis of civil rights and riots into a structured, organized war. The architecture of the next 30 years of violence was built in this single, pivotal year. The creation of the UDR, intended to build bridges, instead solidified sectarian divides. The split in the IRA gave birth to the Provisionals, an organization that would wage one of the most sustained insurgent campaigns of the 20th century. The reactive growth of loyalist paramilitaries like the UVF and the vigilante groups that would soon form the UDA ensured the violence would be a horrifying two-sided affair. And finally, events like the Falls Curfew destroyed trust between the nationalist community and the British Army, recasting soldiers as occupiers and fueling the very insurgency they were sent to suppress. By the time the calendar turned to 1971, all the pieces were in place for the conflict's bloodiest years. The hope of 1969 was a distant memory. The reality of 1970 was armed men on patrol, bombs in pubs and shops, and communities barricaded behind walls of fear. The beginning of a long, dark night that would last for a generation. The year 1970 began with a fragile flicker of hope, but it ended in the hard, unmistakable silhouette of war. What had once been a crisis of rights and representation now hardened into an organized, militarized conflict. The language of protest was replaced by the language of patrols, checkpoints, weapons, and retaliation. Lines that had once seemed blurred were now carved in concrete, wire, and blood. The architecture of the next 3 decades was constructed in this single, pivotal year. The creation of the Ulster Defence Regiment, intended in theory to reassure and stabilize, instead reinforced fear and deepened division. To many in the nationalist community, it appeared less like a protective force and more like an extension of a sectarian security network. What was meant to bridge communities ultimately pushed them further apart, embedding mistrust into the very framework of the state. Within republicanism, the split in the IRA reshaped the future of the conflict. The Provisional IRA emerged not as a fringe group, but as a disciplined, determined organization rooted in the anger of communities that felt abandoned. Young men joined not out of ideology alone, but out of a sense of necessity, a belief that if the state and the police would not protect them, they would have to protect themselves. On the other side, Loyalist paramilitary forces expanded rapidly, convinced they too were defending their existence. Fear fed recruitment. Violence justified more violence. A terrible logic took hold. The streets told the true story of 1970. British Army patrols became permanent fixtures, once welcomed, now increasingly resented. Tensions simmered in every neighborhood. Raids, roadblocks, searches, and arrests became part of daily life. Conversations were whispered. Windows were boarded. Communities withdrew behind barriers both physical and psychological. Children grew accustomed to the sight of rifles and armored vehicles. Normality was quietly erased. And then came the Falls Curfew. For 3 days in July, an entire area of West Belfast was sealed off by troops in an aggressive search for weapons. Homes were torn apart. Thousands were confined within their streets. For civilians were killed. To many in the nationalist community, this was the final betrayal. The soldiers who had arrived as protectors now seemed like an occupying force. Any remaining trust dissolved in clouds of gas and the echoes of gunfire. By autumn, bombs were no longer unthinkable. They were expected. Gun battles were no longer shocking. They were reported. Each new incident hardened attitudes, recruited more fighters, widened the void between the two communities. The idea of a quick return to normality faded into fantasy. Northern Ireland had crossed a threshold from which there was no easy return. When the calendar finally turned to 1971, the framework for prolonged conflict was complete. Armed groups were organized. Tactics were learned. Hatred had been normalized. The hope that had flickered at the beginning of 1970 had been suffocated by reality. What remained was a society preparing itself for a long, grinding, relentless struggle. In this series, we track the conflict 1 year at a time, year by year, moment by moment, not to glorify it, but to understand it, to remember it, and to confront the truth of how a modern society descended into decades of violence. And in Part 4, we enter 1971. The year internment without trial is introduced. The year thousands are arrested and imprisoned based on suspicion alone. The year torture allegations shake the world. And the year the spiral of vengeance tightens beyond control. History isn't made by years. It's made by moments. Single days. Single decisions. For Northern Ireland, 1971 was a year made up entirely of those moments. It was a slow-motion pile-up of miscalculation, escalation, and bloodshed. It was the year a low-level conflict, which had been simmering for years, finally boiled over into a vicious war that would consume a generation. If you want to understand the 3 decades of brutal violence, known as the Troubles, you first have to understand the 365 days of chaos that set the stage for it all. The year is 1971. It began with the death of a single British soldier and ended in a storm of bombings and riots that set Northern Ireland ablaze. This is the story of how a year of fatal decisions and spiraling violence turned a regional conflict into a brutal, decades-long war. 1971 was a decisive year in the Troubles, marked by escalating violence, political upheaval, and the introduction of internment without trial. The year began with tragedy. In February, Gunner Robert Curtis became the first British soldier killed in the conflict. Soon after, the Provisional IRA intensified its campaign, targeting both security forces and civilians. In March, 3 off-duty Scottish soldiers were murdered in Belfast, shocking Britain and fueling Unionist anger. Political instability followed, with Prime Minister James Clark resigning in March and Brian Faulkner taking office. The most controversial development came in August 1971, when the Northern Ireland government introduced internment without trial, aimed at curbing IRA activity. Hundreds of suspected Republicans were arrested, but the policy backfired. Many detainees were innocent, and no Loyalists were interned. This fueled nationalist resentment and sparked widespread riots. The British Army's heavy-handed tactics, including the use of the 5 techniques of interrogation, drew international condemnation. By year's end, violence had escalated dramatically. Bombings, shootings, and reprisals became routine, with over 170 people killed in 1971 alone. The introduction of internment deepened mistrust between Catholic communities and the state, ensuring that the conflict would intensify in the years ahead. To really get 1971, we have to rewind just a little. By the dawn of the new decade, Northern Ireland was already a deeply fractured society. The late 1960s saw the rise of a Catholic civil rights movement demanding an end to systemic discrimination in housing, jobs, and voting rights from the Protestant-dominated Unionist government. Their peaceful marches were often met with state-sanctioned violence, leading to the Battle of the Bogside in Derry in August 1969. The rioting got so intense that the Northern Ireland government had to call for British troops to be deployed to restore order. At first, many Catholics actually welcomed the army as neutral protectors, but that welcome would prove to be fragile and very temporary. The British Army's mission, codenamed Operation Banner, would become the longest continuous deployment in British military history, and its role was about to change completely. By 1971, they weren't seen as peacekeepers anymore, but as an occupying force propping up a sectarian state. The political temperature was soaring. The Provisional Irish Republican Army, or IRA, had split from the more political official IRA, and they were determined to use force to get a united Ireland. Their campaign started with sporadic attacks, but the new year would bring a new, deadlier intensity. On February 6, 1971, during riots in Belfast, a single shot rang out. Gunner Robert Curtis, a 20-year-old soldier, fell to the ground. He is widely considered the first British soldier to be killed in action during what we now call the Troubles. Curtis was married, and a letter was on its way to him with the news that his wife was expecting their first child. He never got to read it. His death was a profound shock. A line had been crossed. For the British public, this conflict was no longer a distant police action. It was a war killing their sons. In Northern Ireland, Prime Minister James Clark went on television and declared, "Northern Ireland is at war with the IRA." But that was just the beginning. The spark was lit. The rest of the year would be spent pouring gasoline on the flames. Curtis's death wasn't an isolated incident. It was the first tremor of an earthquake. The IRA's campaign of violence escalated. Bombings and shootings became an almost daily reality. The British Army responded with huge searches for weapons in nationalist areas, which often turned into destructive house-to-house raids that just fueled more resentment and more riots. This cycle of violence created a pressure cooker, especially for the Unionist government at Stormont. The Loyalist community, who identify as British, felt besieged. They saw the IRA campaign as a threat to their very existence and demanded their government take a harder line. Then came an act of such cold-blooded brutality, it sent a shockwave across the UK. On the evening of March 10th, 3 young, off-duty Scottish soldiers were having a drink in a Belfast pub. They were unarmed and in civilian clothes. 2 were brothers, John McCaig, only 17, and Joseph, 18. With them was 23-year-old Dougal McCoy. They were reportedly lured from the pub, driven to a quiet roadside, and executed by the Provisional IRA. Their bodies were discovered by children. The coroner called it one of the vilest crimes ever heard of in living memory. The murders sparked widespread revulsion. For the Unionist population, it was the final straw. Their demands for tougher action hit a fever pitch. Facing this crisis, and feeling that London wasn't providing a strong enough military response, Prime Minister James Clark resigned. His replacement was a man named Brian Faulkner. Faulkner had a reputation as a unionist hardliner. He came to power on a promise to crush the IRA, and he believed he had the perfect tool to do it. It was a policy that had been used before in Ireland, a blunt instrument from a bygone era. It would prove to be the single most catastrophic decision of the entire conflict. It was called internment. Internment meant prison without trial. Under the Special Powers Act, the government could order the mass arrest and detention of anyone suspected of paramilitary activity. No evidence, no charges, no day in court. By summer 1971, Brian Faulkner was convinced this was the decisive blow needed to break the IRA. He believed if he could round up the leadership in one go, the violence would just stop. The British government in London, led by Prime Minister Edward Heath, gave its reluctant approval. And so, in the pre-dawn darkness of Monday, August 9, 1971, the British Army launched Operation Demetrius. Across Northern Ireland, soldiers smashed down doors, dragging men and boys from their beds. In the initial sweep, more than 340 people were arrested. They were taken to makeshift camps, Crumlin Road Jail, a prison ship called HMS Maidstone, and a new camp at a former airbase called Long Kesh. From the very first moment, Operation Demetrius was a catastrophic failure. First, the intelligence was a disaster. It was hopelessly out of date. Many of those arrested had no connection to any paramilitary group. Some were political activists, others were old Republicans who hadn't been active in years, and many were just innocent civilians swept up in the dragnet. Meanwhile, the Provisional IRA's Chief of Staff held a brazen press conference just days later, claiming that only about 30 of his men had been caught. The big fish had escaped the net. Second, the operation was completely one-sided. Despite a growing campaign of violence by Loyalist paramilitaries who were bombing Catholic-owned businesses, not a single Loyalist was arrested in the initial swoop. Of the roughly 2,000 people interned between 1971 and 1975, around 95% were from the Catholic community. To nationalists, this wasn't about security, it was sectarian oppression. It confirmed their deepest fears, that the state and the British Army acting for it was not a neutral arbiter, but an enemy. The backlash was immediate and explosive. As news of the arrests spread, nationalist areas erupted. Barricades went up, and intense gun battles broke out between the IRA and the British Army. In just the first 4 days, over 20 people were killed. An estimated 7,000 people, almost all of them Catholics, were forced to flee their homes as houses were burned down in the rioting. And in the middle of this chaos, in a small part of West Belfast called Ballymurphy, the violence hit a terrifying peak. Over 36 hours, members of the British Army's elite parachute regiment shot and killed civilians. The victims included Joan Connolly, a mother of 8, and a Catholic priest, Father Hugh Mullen, shot while waving a white cloth to go and help a wounded man. A 2021 inquest found that all of them were entirely innocent, and the Army's use of force was unjustified. The inquest clarified that 9 of the 10 victims were shot by the Army, while another likely died from a heart attack after a confrontation with soldiers. The events became known as the Ballymurphy Massacre. The political fallout was just as bad. The main constitutional nationalist party, the SDLP, walked out of the Stormont Parliament. They launched a campaign of civil disobedience, encouraging a rent and rate strike that saw thousands of households refuse to pay their dues to the state. But maybe the most devastating result of internment was what it did for the IRA. The policy, meant to smash the organization, instead became its greatest recruiting sergeant. Stories of innocent men being dragged from their homes spread like wildfire. For a new generation of young people who saw the raids and the killings, politics seemed hopeless. The IRA, once a fringe group, now looked like the only one who could defend their community. Recruitment surged, and with new members came new money, new weapons, and a new, unshakable resolve. The decision to bring in internment was meant to stop the violence. Instead, it guaranteed the conflict would escalate into a full-blown war. The months after internment weren't a slow escalation. They were an explosion. The solution had unleashed an inferno. The period from August to December 1971 saw Northern Ireland descend into near anarchy. The numbers tell a grim story. More people were killed in the 4 months after internment than in the entire previous year. By the end of 1971, the death toll stood at over 170. Bombings went from being sporadic to a daily terror. In the first 2 weeks of December alone, there were about 70 bombings. For the IRA, the war had entered a new phase. Flush with recruits, they launched a relentless bombing campaign targeting not just security forces, but the economy itself. City centers became ghost towns. The sound of the bomb siren became the soundtrack to daily life. People learned to walk down the middle of the street, as far away from buildings and parked cars as possible. But the violence wasn't just coming from Republicans. Loyalist paramilitary groups, like the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF, responded with their own vicious campaign. They felt the state was failing to protect them and decided to take the law into their own hands, often targeting random Catholic civilians simply to terrorize the entire community. This period led to one of the most infamous atrocities of the entire Troubles. On the night of December 4th, 1971, a Loyalist UVF team planted a bomb at McGurk's Bar, a family-run pub in a Catholic area of North Belfast. It exploded without warning, causing the entire building to collapse. 15 people were killed, including 2 children. The owner's wife and 14-year-old daughter were among the dead. In a move that defined the toxic atmosphere, the security forces immediately claimed it was a Republican-owned goal, a bomb that exploded by accident. This false story, blaming the victims themselves, stuck for years, adding an unbearable insult to the family's grief. It was a stark example of how, in the chaos of 1971, truth itself became a casualty of war. By the end of the year, Northern Ireland was unrecognizable. The British Army was now one side in a brutal 3-way conflict. Nationalist politics had abandoned the state. The Unionist government, having played its final, desperate card, was left powerless. The battle lines that would define the next 3 decades had been carved in stone by the bloodshed and bitterness of 1971. The hope of a quick fix was gone, replaced by a grim acceptance on all sides that this would be a long war. The chaos of that single year had created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence. Attack led to reprisal, which led to revenge. Every funeral bred new gunmen. 1971 didn't start the Troubles, but it was the year the Troubles became the Troubles. It was the year that turned a crisis into a catastrophe, a riot into a war. The Troubles are a complex and often misunderstood part of history. If you want to learn more about the key events that shaped this conflict, make sure you subscribe to Emerald Chronicle for more explorations. And let us know in the comments what other parts of this history you'd like us to cover. Over 3,500 people would lose their lives before the Good Friday Agreement of 1998 brought the main conflict to an end. Many of the bloodiest moments were still to come. But the die was cast in 1971. The introduction of internment is now seen almost universally as a disastrous failure, a policy that did more to fuel the conflict than any other single decision. It alienated an entire community, served as the IRA's most effective recruitment tool, and created a vortex of violence that would pull thousands of lives into its wake. A single year is just a moment in history, but 1971 shows how a rapid series of fatal decisions can have consequences that echo for generations. It stands as a dark lesson in how chaos, once unleashed, can carve its own destructive path, and how the road to a 30-year war can be paved in just 365 days. "1971 ended with a sense of dread that settled over Northern Ireland like winter fog, dense, suffocating, impossible to escape. Whatever boundaries had once existed between policing and war, between repression and retaliation, between fear and fury, were now fully erased. This was the year that took the conflict out of the shadows and placed it squarely in the brutal light of everyday life. The introduction of internment without trial on August 9th was not simply a security measure. It was a rupture, a tearing open of old wounds that had never truly healed. Dragged from their homes in the dead of night, hundreds of Catholic men were arrested without charges, without evidence, and without recourse. Entire communities awoke to the sound of boots on stairs, doors kicked in, men blindfolded and taken away. Many would not return for years. Some would never return at all. Internment was meant to crush the IRA. Instead, it ignited the conflict like a torch to dry grass. Streets that had been tense became battlefields. The anger of a generation poured into the ranks of the Provisional IRA, transforming them from a small, reactive force into a powerful, structured insurgency. Young men who had once kept their distance now flocked to join, convinced that peaceful measures were dead, that the state had declared war on their community. Meanwhile, allegations of torture, the 5 techniques, reverberated across Europe, staining Britain's reputation and hardening nationalist resolve. These were no longer just security operations. They were symbols of humiliation, reminders of a system that many believed saw them not as citizens, but as suspects by birth. On the Loyalist side, the sense of siege deepened. Gun attacks, bombings, and assassinations by Republican groups fueled the rapid expansion of the UVF and newly formed UDA. Loyalist paramilitaries grew in both confidence and cruelty, convinced they were defending their streets from an existential threat. Violence became a currency, and both sides spent it freely. 1971 was also the year when civilians increasingly became the targets, not by accident, but by strategy. Bombs in pubs, shootings at bus stops, drive-by attacks on random passers-by shattered any illusion that the conflict still had rules. No one was truly safe. Children walked to school past armored vehicles. Families checked under their cars before leaving home. Nightfall brought a silence filled not with calm, but with foreboding. And then, at the very end of the year, came a killing that would transform everything. The shooting of 14-year-old Annette McGavigan in Derry, one of dozens of children killed in the escalating crossfire. Her death symbolized the tragedy of a generation growing up knowing nothing but fear, suspicion, and the cold presence of armed men on every corner. By December, it was clear that 1971 had not simply deepened the troubles, it had redefined them. The conflict was now sustained, organized, and spiraling. The political center had collapsed. Communities lived behind barricades, walls, and barbed wire. The violence was no longer seasonal or reactive. It was structural. It was permanent. It was normal. And yet, the darkest chapter had not even begun. In this major 30-part series, The Troubles 1968 to 1998 on Emerald Chronicle, we will continue to trace Northern Ireland's descent year by year, uncovering how each decision, each killing, each policy, and each act of retaliation shaped the next. In Part 5, we enter 1972, the bloodiest year of the entire conflict, a year of mass bombings, collapsing governments, and the day that would scar a nation forever, Bloody Sunday. The year when death came to feel ordinary. The year when the world could no longer look away. In the long and violent history of the Troubles, one year stands apart. Not for a peace treaty or a political breakthrough, but for the sheer, unrelenting scale of its bloodshed. 1972. It was a year when Northern Ireland descended into a brutal, low-level war, a chaotic vortex of political failure and paramilitary fury that consumed an entire generation. In just 12 months, nearly 500 people were killed, a catastrophic death toll that represents a substantial portion of the fatalities for the entire 3-decade conflict. For those who lived through it, it was a time of daily fear, of bomb scares clearing city streets, and the constant, sickening news of another neighbor, another soldier, another child lost to the violence. This is the story of how that 1 year of relentless bloodshed, from the tragedy of Bloody Sunday to the chaos of Bloody Friday, created a cycle of violence so vicious and so deep that its aftershocks would be felt for decades to come, hardening divisions that have still not fully healed. This is the story of 1972, the Troubles' darkest chapter. To understand the explosion of violence that was 1972, you have to understand the pressure that had been building for years. By the dawn of the new year, Northern Ireland was already a tinderbox. The optimism of the late 1960s civil rights movement, which had peacefully marched for an end to discrimination against the Catholic minority, had curdled into despair. The state's response to these demands for basic rights had all too often been violent and repressive. At its heart, the conflict was a clash of two identities. For Unionists, overwhelmingly Protestant, being part of the United Kingdom was non-negotiable. They saw the Northern Irish state, with its own parliament at Stormont, as the ultimate guarantee of their British identity. For nationalists, overwhelmingly Catholic, the partition of Ireland in 1921 was a historical injustice. They felt like second-class citizens, and many aspired to a united Ireland. The late 60s saw these tensions boil over. Civil rights marches were met with police brutality. Sectarian riots erupted. The British Army, initially sent in 1969 to keep the two sides apart, was increasingly seen by nationalists not as a neutral peacekeeper, but as an occupying force. Paramilitary groups on both sides, long dormant, began to rearm. The split within the Irish Republican Army in 1969 created the Provisional IRA, a more aggressive faction dedicated to armed struggle to force a British withdrawal. They believed that only force could achieve their goal of a united Ireland. On the other side, loyalist groups like the Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF, and the New Ulster Defence Association, UDA, prepared to meet this threat with violence of their own. But the single most destabilizing decision came in August 1971, internment without trial. In dawn raids, hundreds of men were arrested and imprisoned indefinitely. The policy was a disaster. The intelligence was poor, and many of those arrested had no paramilitary connections. Crucially, it was almost entirely one-sided. Of the initial 342 people arrested, the overwhelming majority were Catholic nationalists. Instead of crushing the IRA, internment supercharged it. The policy caused outrage across the Catholic community, driving a flood of new recruits into the arms of the provisionals. The violence surged. In the 7 months before internment, 34 people had died in the conflict. In the 5 months after, that number skyrocketed to over 140. As 1971 bled into 1972, Northern Ireland was on a knife edge. The political center had collapsed. The security situation was spiraling. And the state, through internment, had alienated an entire community, convincing thousands of young people that the only answer left was the gun. The stage was set for a catastrophe. The event that tipped Northern Ireland over the precipice came on January 30th, 1972, in the city of Derry. It was a day that would be seared into the collective memory of the nationalist community as Bloody Sunday. The Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association had organized a march to protest internment. Despite a ban, thousands gathered in a determined, almost carnival-like atmosphere. Their route was blocked by British Army barricades. As the main body of the march turned for a rally, a small number of youths began throwing stones at soldiers, a common occurrence at such protests. In response, soldiers from the 1st Battalion of the Parachute Regiment, an elite and notoriously tough unit, were ordered to move in and begin an arrest operation. What happened next turned a protest into a massacre. In the space of about 30 minutes, the paratroopers opened fire with their high-velocity rifles. They shot 26 unarmed civilians. 13 died on the streets that day. A 14th man died from his injuries months later. Victims were shot running away. They were shot crawling to safety. They were shot while trying to aid the wounded. One of the most enduring images of the Troubles is of a local priest, the future Bishop Edward Daly, waving a blood-stained handkerchief as he escorted a dying young man to safety. The soldiers later claimed they had come under attack from IRA gunmen and bombers. But eyewitnesses told a different story, that the soldiers fired indiscriminately into a terrified, fleeing crowd. Decades later, a massive public inquiry, the Seville Inquiry, would vindicate the marchers. It concluded that none of the victims posed a threat, that the soldiers had lost control, and that many of them had knowingly put forward false accounts to justify their actions. The impact was catastrophic. In Dublin, a furious crowd burned the British embassy to the ground. For the nationalist community, any remaining faith in the British state was shattered. Bloody Sunday became the single greatest recruiting sergeant the Provisional IRA ever had. Young men who had previously shunned violence now saw armed struggle as the only possible response to state violence. A moderate politician who helped organize the march later noted that before that day, the IRA in Derry was a small force. After it, their ranks swelled with new recruits seeking revenge. The nonviolent civil rights movement's creed of peaceful change had been shot to pieces on the streets of the Bogside. The spark was lit, and the firestorm was about to begin. The shockwaves from Bloody Sunday radiated out from Derry, destabilizing an already fragile political system. The violence that followed was immediate and ferocious. The Provisional IRA, newly emboldened, dramatically escalated its campaign. The British Prime Minister at the time, Edward Heath, would later admit the events of that day destroyed any prospect of a political solution. Northern Ireland was becoming ungovernable. The Unionist-led government at Stormont, headed by Prime Minister Brian Faulkner, found itself trapped. On one hand, it faced an unprecedented IRA onslaught. On the other, it was losing the confidence of London. The British government had come to a stark conclusion. The 50-year-old experiment in devolved government at Stormont had failed. Its security policies, like internment, had only made things worse. Fearing a slide into all-out civil war, Heath took a radical step. He demanded that control over all security matters be transferred from Belfast to London. For Faulkner's government, this was a line they couldn't cross. They refused. In response, on March 24, 1972, Heath announced that the Parliament of Northern Ireland at Stormont was being suspended. Devolved government was over. Northern Ireland would now be governed by direct rule from London, under a new Secretary of State, William Whitelaw. The imposition of direct rule was a political earthquake. For Unionists, it was a profound betrayal. For 50 years, Stormont had been the symbol of their power. Now London had suspended it. This sense of betrayal fueled a dramatic growth in Loyalist paramilitary groups, who felt they could no longer trust the state to protect them. For nationalists, the reaction was more complex. The fall of Stormont was a key objective for the IRA. They saw it as a victory, believing they had broken the local government and could now force a direct confrontation with Britain. For the Provisional IRA, direct rule was proof their strategy was working. Far from de-escalating, they believed one final, massive push could force a complete British withdrawal. The suspension of Stormont didn't bring peace. It cleared the battlefield for a more direct and brutal phase of the war. The imposition of direct rule didn't calm the waters. Instead, it was like throwing fuel onto a fire. The paramilitary groups on both sides unleashed a new level of ferocity, determined to shape the future with bombs and bullets. The Provisional IRA, believing they were on the cusp of victory, sought to make Northern Ireland ungovernable. The statistics are staggering. In 1972, the IRA killed approximately 100 members of the security forces, wounded 500 more, and carried out almost 1,300 bombings, an average of nearly 4 a day. The car bomb became a signature weapon. On March 20th, a car bomb on Donegal Street in Belfast killed 7 people and injured nearly 150. The targets were often economic, aimed at crippling the region's economy. But the violence wasn't one-sided. As the IRA campaign grew, so did the reaction from Loyalist paramilitaries like the UDA and UVF. Fueled by the fear that Britain was abandoning them, they began a campaign of sectarian assassination. Catholic civilians were targeted simply because of their religion, often abducted and brutally murdered in tit-for-tat reprisals. Amid this chaos, there was one significant development. The official IRA, the other Republican faction, was also engaged in its own campaign. In February, seeking revenge for Bloody Sunday, they planted a car bomb outside the officers' mess of the 16th Parachute Brigade in Aldershot, England. The bomb killed 7 people, but none were soldiers. The victims were 5 female cleaners, a gardener, and a Catholic army chaplain. The backlash was immense. The killing of innocent civilians caused widespread revulsion and was a public relations disaster. This, combined with another incident where they killed a young local Catholic soldier home on leave, turned their own community against them. Recognizing their campaign was counterproductive, the official IRA announced a permanent ceasefire on May 29, 1972. Their main campaign was over. This left the Provisional IRA as the dominant Republican force. The British government, desperate for a way out, even made a secret approach to their leadership. In late June, the Provisionals announced a temporary truce for talks. In early July, an IRA delegation, including a young Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, were secretly flown to London to meet with Secretary of State William Whitelaw. The talks failed. The IRA demanded a British withdrawal by 1975. The British government refused. The ceasefire collapsed within 2 weeks. The brief hope for peace was extinguished. Convinced that only overwhelming force would work, the Provisional IRA decided it was time to escalate. They were about to unleash the single most intense bombing attack of the entire conflict. Just 12 days after the failed peace talks, the Provisional IRA delivered its terrifying response. On the afternoon of Friday, July 21, 1972, they launched an operation of unprecedented ferocity in the heart of Belfast. It would become known as Bloody Friday. The plan was to create maximum chaos. Within a terrifyingly compressed window of about 80 minutes, at least 22 bombs exploded across the city. Most were powerful car bombs targeting key infrastructure like bus stations and railway lines. The result was pandemonium. As explosions rocked the city, one after another, panic ensued. The Guardian newspaper reported Belfast was reduced to near total chaos and panic. Clouds of thick smoke enveloped buildings as the sound of one blast was immediately followed by another. The IRA later claimed they had given warnings for each bomb. The security forces countered that they were completely overwhelmed by the sheer number of bombs and a flood of hoax calls, making it impossible to clear every area in time. Whatever the truth, the outcome was devastating. 9 people were killed and 130 were injured, many suffering horrific, life-altering mutilations. Of the injured, 77 were women and children. The deadliest blast was at the Oxford Street bus depot, where a car bomb killed 6 people. 2 British soldiers and 4 civilian bus employees. One was just a 15-year-old boy. Another blast on the Cave Hill Road killed 3 more civilians, including a 14-year-old boy. His father would go on to found a peace group, dedicating his life to reconciliation. The images from that day were broadcast around the world. Horrifying pictures of rescue workers scraping human remains from the streets into plastic bags. Bloody Friday was a profound shock, even for a population accustomed to violence. It was a strategic disaster for the IRA. The sheer carnage repulsed many, including potential sympathizers. But its most immediate consequence was to trigger a massive response from the British government. The images of Belfast being torn apart convinced the government they had to act decisively. The Republican no-go areas that were barricaded off and effectively controlled by the IRA could no longer be tolerated. The state was about to strike back with overwhelming force. The events of 1972 left scars on communities that are still felt today. If you or your family have a connection to this period of history, please share your reflections in the comments below. Hearing these personal stories is a vital part of understanding the human cost of the conflict. Ten days after the horror of Bloody Friday, in the pre-dawn darkness of July 31st, 1972, the British state launched its response. It was called Operation Motorman, and it was described as the largest British military operation since the 1956 Suez Crisis. Its objective was simple: to smash the barricades, retake the no-go areas, and reassert British authority. The scale was immense. Around 4,000 extra troops were brought in, bringing the total number of soldiers involved to nearly 22,000, including infantry and armored battalions. For the first and only time in the Troubles, the army deployed heavy armor, Centurion tanks fitted with massive bulldozer blades. Their purpose was psychological and practical: to tear down the walls of the self-declared Free Derry. The IRA, which patrolled these areas openly, knew an operation was imminent. Faced with overwhelming numbers, they chose not to stand and fight. A direct confrontation would have been suicidal. Before the operation began, the IRA leadership ordered its volunteers to withdraw and melt away. At around 4 a.m., the operation began. In Derry, the Centurion tanks rumbled through the Bogside and Cregan, effortlessly crashing through the barricades. Behind them, thousands of troops flooded the areas, establishing checkpoints. Similar operations took place in nationalist parts of Belfast and other towns. Militarily, the operation was a success. The no-go areas were eliminated with little resistance. But it was not without bloodshed. During the incursion in Derry, British soldiers shot 4 people, killing 2. One was Daniel Hegarty, a 15-year-old civilian who was shot twice in the head at close range. The other was Seamus Bradley, a 19-year-old unarmed IRA supporter. Operation Motorman marked the end of one phase of the conflict. The era of the IRA openly controlling territory was over. From now on, they would be forced to operate as a covert guerrilla army. While the operation re-established state control, it did so at the cost of further alienating the local population, who saw the heavily armed troops and new fortresses as an army of occupation. The barricades were gone, but the battle for hearts and minds was being decisively lost. Operation Motorman may have torn down the physical barricades, but it did nothing to address the hatred and fear that built them. The hope that this massive show of force might quell the violence was tragically misplaced. The second half of 1972 was just as bloody as the first. Just hours after Motorman began, the IRA demonstrated its continued lethality. In the small village of Claudy, 3 car bombs exploded, killing 9 civilians in an attack that was never claimed but widely attributed to the provisionals. The violence continued relentlessly. August of 1972 saw numerous killings. On August 22nd, a premature IRA bomb at a customs post in Newry killed 9 people, including 3 of the IRA members planting it. The tit-for-tat nature of the conflict became its defining feature. An IRA attack would be followed by a Loyalist paramilitary murder. A Loyalist bombing would be met with an IRA ambush. Each death demanded another in return, a grim equation that spiraled endlessly. Communities retreated further into themselves, gripped by fear. Mixed neighborhoods began to empty out as families fled to the safety of their own sectarian heartlands. The so-called peace walls, giant barriers built to separate the two communities, began to multiply across Belfast, physical manifestations of the deep chasm that now divided society. By the end of the year, the final, dreadful toll was counted. Sources vary, but most confirm just under 500 deaths for 1972. The majority, over half, were civilians caught in the crossfire or deliberately targeted. It was by far the deadliest year of the entire 30-year conflict. It was a year of absolute extremes. The state repression of Bloody Sunday, the political collapse of direct rule, the mass bombing of Bloody Friday, and the military invasion of Operation Motorman. Each event was a turning point that led not to resolution, but to a deeper, more intractable war. "1972 was the year the Troubles came of age. It was the year that destroyed any lingering hope for a quick or simple solution. The events of those 12 months, from the state-sanctioned killings of Bloody Sunday to the mass civilian casualties of Bloody Friday, forged the conflict's brutal character for the next quarter of a century. It was the year the political center was hollowed out, leaving a vacuum filled by the men of violence. It was the year the IRA's campaign reached its most ferocious intensity, and the year Loyalist paramilitaries responded with a campaign of brutal sectarian murder. It was the year that divisions, once political, were solidified in blood. The cycle of attack and revenge became an engine of its own, consuming lives and poisoning society for a generation. The nearly 500 deaths of 1972 weren't just a statistic. They represented a fundamental hardening of the conflict, entrenching paramilitary groups and cementing the hatreds that would make the path to peace so long and so arduous. The darkness that fell over Northern Ireland in 1972 would not fully lift for more than 2 decades. Remembering that brutal year isn't just about recounting history. It's about understanding the catastrophic human cost of political failure and the terrifying speed at which a society can descend into war with itself. "1972 ended as the bloodiest year of the Troubles, a year soaked in violence so relentless that it reshaped the very psychology of Northern Ireland. What began in January with the shock of Bloody Sunday unfolded into 12 months of killings, ambushes, bombings, and political collapse. By the time the year was over, more than 470 people were dead: civilians, soldiers, police officers, and paramilitaries. Entire communities were haunted by funerals, by wreaths on doors, by the hollow silence after yet another explosion. A generation came of age surrounded by grief. 1972 was the year when the conflict ceased to be a crisis and became a grim, grinding fact of life. Bombings struck almost daily, turning streets, shops, bars, and bus stops into unpredictable killing grounds. The practice of planting bombs, warning or no warning, became a central tactic. On Bloody Friday in July, the Provisional IRA detonated 22 bombs in Belfast in a span of just over an hour. 9 people were killed, hundreds injured, and the city was left trembling. Smoke rising, sirens wailing, people running through streets they no longer recognized. The British state responded with increasing force. Operation Motorman in July saw armored bulldozers and thousands of troops move into the no-go areas, ending the barricaded Free Derry and Free Belfast. The sight of armored personnel carriers rolling through narrow streets, tearing down barricades, marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a phase of the conflict more militarized, more sophisticated, and more unpredictable. And above it all, politics crumbled. Stormont, the parliament that had ruled Northern Ireland since partition, was suspended in March. The government that had once promised stability collapsed under the weight of distrust and escalating bloodshed. Direct rule from London began, signaling that even the British state had lost faith in the old structures of authority. Northern Ireland now drifted without a political center, guided instead by fear, revenge, and the cold logic of armed struggle. Loyalist violence surged, mirroring the expansion of Republican militancy. The UDA and UVF grew in strength, ruthlessness, and organization, leaving their own trail of sectarian killings. Retaliation followed retaliation in a cycle that seemed without end. Many of the victims were chosen not for who they were, but for what community they belonged to, a terrifying new reality that shattered any illusion of safety. For ordinary people, 1972 felt like living inside an emergency that never stopped. Nights were punctured by gunfire. Days were measured in explosions. Armed soldiers searched cars, raided homes, and patrolled school routes. Parents walked their children past checkpoints and soldiers in flak jackets. Trust between neighbors, between communities, between the public and the state was eroding by the hour. By the year's end, Northern Ireland stood transformed. Streets were scarred by bomb craters. Walls were covered in murals and slogans. Peace lines, built as temporary measures, were becoming permanent barriers. The dream of a quick resolution was gone, replaced by the grim understanding that the conflict had settled in for the long term. Yet, even in this darkest year, there were flickers, faint, fragile, of something different. Ceasefire talks were attempted. Political proposals were drafted. Leaders on both sides began, however cautiously, to acknowledge that military victory was impossible. In this series, we follow the troubles 1 year at a time, tracing how each decision and each tragedy shaped the next chapter of the conflict. And in Part 6, we enter 1973, a year of political experiments, failed negotiations, and the first serious attempt to build a new future. A year when the guns never fully fell silent, but the idea of peace, distant and fragile, began to take shape. Would the violence ease? Could a settlement be found? Or would the promises of 1973 collapse under the weight of history? Join us next as the story continues. As we reach the end of this first chapter, the years 1968 through 1972 stand before us not merely as a historical period, but as a crucible in which Northern Ireland was forged anew. Its society fractured, its people scarred, and its future uncertain. These first 5 years of the Troubles were defined by awakening and upheaval, a collision of long-simmering grievances with violent resistance, and the heartbreaking human cost that accompanied it. What began as peaceful demands for civil rights quickly spiraled into a maelstrom of conflict, leaving in its wake homes destroyed, neighborhoods divided, and families traumatized. We have walked the streets of Belfast and Derry during the height of unrest, felt the tension of communities barricaded behind walls of fear, and witnessed the first tragic chapters of a cycle that would endure for decades. Bloody Sunday, Bloody Friday, and countless smaller, often overlooked events revealed not only the fragility of peace, but the profound failure of political institutions to protect ordinary citizens. In these formative years, the patterns of the Troubles emerged: sectarian violence, paramilitary mobilization, and the recurring cycle of retaliation and grief that would define the conflict for generations. Yet amidst the violence and despair, we have also glimpsed resilience. Communities struggled to survive under relentless pressure. Families endured displacement, loss, and the ever-present threat of attack. Children navigated lives interrupted by barricades and checkpoints. Neighbors leaned on each other for protection and sustenance. Activists, clergy, and journalists risked their safety to bear witness, to document injustice, and to remind the world that behind the headlines were human beings living in a society teetering on the edge of collapse. These personal stories of courage, endurance, and moral conviction remind us that the Troubles were not abstract. They were intensely lived and deeply felt. The political landscape of 1968 to 1972 also offers crucial lessons. Attempts at reform were repeatedly undermined, and the institutions of power struggled to adapt to a society in turmoil. Power-sharing initiatives, initially promising, fell apart under pressure from extremists on both sides. Governments, both local and British, were ill-prepared for the rapid escalation of violence, and their missteps often intensified community divisions rather than healing them. The seeds of mistrust, resentment, and radicalization were planted during these years, and their consequences would echo long into the following decades. As Part 1 closes, we see clearly that the Troubles were more than sporadic outbreaks of violence. They were a sustained, multifaceted crisis, a combination of political failure, social inequity, and deep-seated sectarianism. They were also, tragically, a human story. Ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, became unwilling participants in a conflict that would define the rest of their lives. The trauma, the grief, the courage, and the moments of solidarity during these early years set the stage for the next phase of the conflict. Which brings us to the next chapter, the years 1973 to 1977, a period of both hope and despair, when the conflict deepened and the search for a political solution intensified. In Part 2, we will witness the aftermath of the early years of violence, the consolidation of paramilitary activity, the intensification of sectarian attacks, and the rise of a new, more organized phase of political struggle. The Sunningdale Agreement of 1973, a bold attempt at power-sharing between Unionists and Nationalists, will emerge as a central narrative, offering a brief glimmer of hope that reconciliation might be possible. Yet, as we will see, this fragile experiment faced overwhelming resistance from extremists and from those unwilling to compromise, ultimately collapsing in the face of mounting violence. During these years, the civilian population continued to bear the brunt of the conflict. Bombings, assassinations, and street violence became daily realities, and communities became ever more polarized. Political debates in Belfast, London, and Dublin unfolded alongside, and often in direct response to, the grim realities of the streets. The interplay of local politics, international pressure, and grassroots activism created a complex tapestry of struggle, where every gain seemed fragile and every loss deeply felt. Part 2 will explore these dynamics in detail, highlighting how the decisions of politicians and the actions of paramilitary groups alike shaped the lives of ordinary citizens and the course of the conflict itself. We will also examine how the social fabric of Northern Ireland evolved under the shadow of violence. Communities fortified themselves, sometimes to survive, sometimes to assert identity. Neighborhoods became more insular, friendships and families were tested by differing allegiances, and children grew up in an environment where fear, suspicion, and political ideology were ever present. Yet even in this darkness, there were moments of humanity, acts of courage, solidarity, and compassion that punctuated the narrative of despair. These stories remind us that, while the Troubles were a product of division, they were also shaped by the choices of individuals who refused to surrender entirely to fear or hatred. Part 2 will also illuminate the continuing failures and occasional successes of political initiatives. The Sunningdale Agreement, for all its promise, ultimately failed to create a sustainable power-sharing arrangement. Yet it laid the groundwork for lessons that would inform later efforts, including the eventual Good Friday Agreement of 1998. By studying these years, we gain insight into both the limitations of political solutions in the face of entrenched conflict and the resilience of communities determined to survive, adapt, and protect what mattered most to them. As we leave the first 5-year chapter behind, it is clear that the story of 1968 to 1972 is not simply a prologue. It is the foundation upon which the rest of the Troubles would be built. The patterns of violence, the failures of governance, the resilience of communities, and the human cost of division all emerge here, and they echo throughout the subsequent decades. This is a story of a society struggling with itself, a people caught between hope and despair, and a conflict that would demand extraordinary courage and resilience from all who lived through it. And so we prepare to turn the page, to step into the next 5-year chapter, 1973 to 1977, a period of political experimentation, violent escalation, and continued human suffering. The Sunningdale Agreement, its promise and its collapse, will show us both the potential and the peril of attempting to reconcile deeply divided communities. In Part 2, we will witness the intensification of paramilitary campaigns, the complex interplay between local and international politics, and the unyielding spirit of ordinary people determined to survive in a world torn apart by conflict. This is more than history. It is a journey through the human consequences of division and an exploration of the forces, both destructive and redemptive, that shaped Northern Ireland during its most turbulent decades. Part 1 closes here, with the first 5 years behind us and Part 2 waiting, ready to reveal the next stage of a conflict that would define a generation and challenge the very fabric of society.